It's Ben here, and here in this video we're going to have a look at how we animate images in Final Cut Pro in a couple different ways. We're going to first of all have a look at how we animate using keyframes in Final Cut Pro. You have some different levels of control here than you do with something like the Ken Burns tool that we'll have a look at afterwards. So we've got our timeline set up here. It's a 1920 by 1080, so a landscape timeline, and we're going to begin to drop some still images on this timeline. So I'm going to come up to my library here and we'll drag down a couple of images just to look at what we get when we first drop images onto the timeline. So what you'll see with this first image is we have the full image on screen, and then we get this letterboxing on the left and right of our image. So basically the whole image is showing that it's fitting in to the aspect ratio of the video that we have set up. And then for this portrait photograph, we have the same thing, except just bigger black boxes on the left and right. And we're going to look at how we can manage that with the transform tools and then also with animation tools. So we'll come back to this first image. So if we have a look at our inspector at the top right, and if you don't see your inspector, just go to Window, Show in Workspace, and make sure the inspector is checked. And if your interface looks super different to mine, then just go to Window, Workspaces, and set the default workspace. And you should see something similar to what I have set up here. So the option that's making this image fit our timeline here is this Spatial Conform. So if we go from Fit to Fill, it's going to fill the video. If we go from Fill to None, then it's going to show the image at its original resolution. Now this is kind of useful to see because then you can tell how much you can zoom in and out of your image before it's 100%. So we can see the scale here is 100% when it's set to None, but it's also set to 100% when it's set to Fill. So this is kind of more useful, I find, to be able to know exactly how much we're kind of modifying it by. So you can see as I zoom out, when we're getting to the point where this fills that space, we're getting to about 35% of the original image size. So we're super zoomed out. So we've got lots of options for zooming in to this image without losing any quality. So you see when we go past 100%, we're going to start to get that blurriness, some problems around the edges there. And we can modify the image size here before we even get into the keyframing side of things. And then we can also come to our transform tools on the bottom left of our video display here. And we can't see the edges of this yet, but if we just zoom out a little bit to about 50%, and then we'll turn on our transform options at the bottom left here, and you'll see we can see the edge of that image. And here now we can move this around and rescale it within the window here. So you can see where we can find those edges, and we can also keep an eye on the percentage here to make sure that we don't go up too much beyond that 100% if we're scaling it up. So before we even get into the animation, there's a couple of options here that we have. One is obviously to scale it. If we push from the top and bottom, we can actually distort our image, and you can see here my scale Y is different to my scale X, which means the image is being squashed. Definitely not something you want to do. We're going to click up at the top here and reset the parameters so these all jump back to 100, and then we can zoom out again. And you can see we can also move this around, as we mentioned, and then we can also rotate it as well. So if you need to straighten out images, get that horizon line just right, then we can do that using the transform tools here. We want this without any rotation at the moment. This photo looks pretty good, so I'm going to reset the rotation parameter here. For a basic animation, if I come to the beginning of my image, then I can turn on my keyframing up at the top left here, or I can turn it on for the scale or rotation or specific items up in my inspector at the top right. And then what I'm basically doing with keyframing is between 2 points. So we'll come partway into this image, I'm animating one element. So it could be the scale or the movement or a bit of both. So you can see I'm scaling this up. And now between this point and that first keyframe, we're going to get a nice zoom in. So if we want to see those keyframes, we can right click on our clip and go to Show Video Animation. And you can see now I've got these two sets of keyframes for that change in scale. Now if I move these close together, then it's going to be a much faster animation. And if I move them further apart, then it's going to be a much slower animation. Now one thing to note with the animation that we have here is that there's a little bit of acceleration and deceleration as we're doing this. And if we come to this last keyframe here, and actually I'm going to move this across as well so we can see that animation line, you can see that if I right click or control and click here, I can change this from smooth to linear. So essentially what that means is we're going to get acceleration or deceleration with this smooth option, or we're going to get a constant motion with the linear option. So if you're finding that your animations are kind of starting off a bit too slowly, then changing it to a linear animation may be what you want to do, and it will keep that nice smooth animation. Okay, so you can see we're zooming in, and there we go. So if we close the video animation here, the same thing will happen with our portrait image too. So I'm going to turn off the fitting and change that to none, and you can see this image is easily big enough to fill that space. Now, just as we did before, we don't want to necessarily resize from the sides here because it's going to distort our image. If we hold down Shift when we do that, then it will keep the proportion. So we can resize from the side. Sort of do a little pan down here. So I'm going to start up at the top, and we'll come to the beginning of our clip. And sometimes you'll find these animation keyframes will pop on and off. Just going to toggle that, and we'll come ahead in time and then come down, and we get that nice kind of pan of the image. And there's a little bit of acceleration, deceleration at the beginning and end of that image. So if we want that to be a constant motion, again, then we can right click or control and click on these endpoints and make them linear, and you'll see then we get a kind of constant motion without that acceleration at the beginning and end. So you can see you can quite quickly make a nice little slideshow. I'm just going to shorten these clips, and then I'm going to come to my transitions. We'll come to dissolves, and we'll just choose a basic cross dissolve, and you'll see we get a nice move between those different images. And again, if we feel like our animation is too quick, then I can always right click, show my video animation, and then here this animation is kind of close to the end, so I can actually stretch out my clip, move this all the way to the end, and then trim from the end there, and we'll still get that nice animation and then a bit of a slower animation for the second clip. So one thing to be careful with when you're actually doing some of these animations is that you keep an eye on your keyframes. And what that means is whenever we make an animation, I'm going to delete the transition here, just going to stretch this out. When we create our animation, I'm going to show the video animation here, we create these keyframes for motion within our clips. So if I come to a point here in this clip and decide that I want the animation to happen a bit quicker, then I'll move down a bit, and what's going to happen here is we'll play through our clip, and then when we get to this, what we thought was the end point, we'll get a little strange bounce back. So you can see, because I've got two keyframes there, we're moving forwards and then backwards. And this is a common thing that will happen when you begin to keyframe, is that you kind of get too many keyframes and things can go a bit wild when you do it, and you can end up with, you know, some strange bouncing around of your keyframes. So when we're working with keyframes, I can obviously right click here and delete keyframes that I don't want. And importantly, what we want to do is when we add new keyframes, we can see them here. We can also see them up in the transform properties up in the inspector. And what's useful here is these little backwards and forwards arrows that we can see. So for the position animation, you can see I can jump between specific keyframes using this forwards and backwards button, and that will allow me to make sure that I'm at a keyframe. You can see it highlights yellow in the inspector when I'm actually on that specific keyframe. So if I want to remove a keyframe, then I can do that here, and then that means that I'm not creating lots and lots of different keyframes along the timeline. I'm going to add that keyframe back in, but also it means that if I'm making an adjustment of the end or start of my animation, then I'm not adding lots of other little keyframes in there as well. So keep an eye out for that little yellow indicator which highlights that you're actually on that specific keyframe. So let's close the video animation here. We're going to add this one last image here. So we're going to take off the fit and change that to none, and then we'll hold down Shift and rescale this, so we're going to zoom in on it, and we're going to have a little look at the rotation option here. So you can see with the rotation, I need to keep an eye out for when the edges are going to get cropped off. So I'm just going to increase the size of this a little bit so that when I actually rotate this, it doesn't crop or have any black edges when the angle of this kind of hits the corners of my video. So for rotation, I'm going to reset this up here. We can do the same kind of thing, and a couple different things with the rotation. So if I set a keyframe for my rotation, you can see that when I rotate it once, it goes to 359 degrees, and that number will keep increasing depending on how many times you're spinning. Now I've actually spun that at the first keyframe, so I want to set that keyframe and then move ahead in time, and we're going to rotate this once here, and we can also modify the values by sliding along the number in the inspector as well. So you can see we get that rotation, and again, if we wanted to say speed that up a little bit so that it's rotating multiple times, then we can just keep going round a couple more times until we get to this spot, and then we'll get a quicker rotation. Now what you might find when you do something like this is that you might want to add a little bit of motion blur on something like a rotation so that you get a little bit of movement there. So I'm going to go to my effects and my blur, and I'm going to add a radial blur on here as well. And what we'll do is I'm going to set the amount of this to 0 at the beginning, then just come ahead a couple of frames, and then we'll push this up. And I'm going to turn on my video animation here. And again, another useful point where we can come to a specific keyframe here. I'm going to add a keyframe, I'm going to go back one frame, add another keyframe, and come to this end keyframe and set that to 0. So basically when we rotate, we're going to get some motion blur in there, and that's going to help it seem a bit more realistic as that rotates. And we could increase the motion blur at some point during there as well, and find out what works for your animation. That's having a look at the animation with keyframes tools that we have here in Final Cut Pro. We can navigate those keyframes up in the effects panel, and we can also navigate those keyframes up here in our video as well by using those forwards and backwards buttons to move between different keyframes that we've added in our video. Now, when we're hovering over this video, we don't see the options for that because we have this second clip selected yellow. So I need to deselect that before the clip that I don't have selected will show me those options. So you can see now I can move forwards and backwards between those keyframes. I can add them and remove them here as well if I want to. And actually, we'll just do one more animation here. I'm going to use this book here, and we'll zoom into this. And basically here what we're going to do is do an animation of a kind of nested clip. So with this, we want to be a little bit careful with it because we want to increase and zoom in on this, but be able to actually have something highlight part of this image. So I'm going to come to this level here, and then partway through I'm going to come and add on an overlay. I'm going to use one of the markup overlays, so this little outline animation. I'll just drop this on here, and basically what that's going to do is draw a line around an object. And actually I need to turn off my motion controls before I can modify this. So you can see I move in here, I've got some options for increasing the size of this, and we'll change the color of this as well. And I'm going to change the overlay option here to normal, so we just get that hard red line. We'll trim this from the end so it matches the length of our clip. So we can see this highlighting the book here, and basically what we want to do is actually zoom in on this area here. Now there's a couple different ways of doing this. We're going to focus on the keyframes method. So if I want to do that, then I can't animate the outline or the book on its own. I'm going to have to turn those into a compound clip. So I'm going to highlight both of those. So basically I'm going to click and hold, drag across both those clips, and then go to File, New, and Compound Clip, or Option and G. We'll call this Book Highlights. And so now, once we've got that, we can see that's going to animate on, and then as it animates on, I'm going to zoom into it as well. So I'm going to add a keyframe. So you can see this purple is our nested clip, and then once that animation is completing or almost completed. I'm going to zoom in, and you can see with that nested clip it allows me to move both of those at the same time, and I can just recenter this. Now the only issue with this is it's going to crop it to the size of the clip, so we have to think about that before we kind of plan out these moves. So basically now we have this, you can see it zooms in and then highlights. So in this instance with animation that's nested, if we wanted to say change the color of this outline or something else with the clip, we'd need to double click into our compound clip so that we can then select the outline. And you can see the way that this works is we're in our compound clip and then we can go back to our main timeline. So I'm going to change the color of this here. We'll change it to a kind of green. And then we'll go back, and now changing that in that compound clip will change how that works in here. We'll turn off our motion controls and come back to fit, and you can see now we've got these different ways in which we can animate and think about how we add effects or options to those animations within Final Cut Pro. Now one last thing here with this book highlight is if we don't want it to actually animate out at the end, we want it to kind of hold once that animation is finished, then I can click on my clip at the point at which I want to hold it. I'm going to go to modify, retime, and hold, and that's basically going to allow me to hold this clip here for as long as I want. And I can remove the end of that clip, so basically we could transition away from that rather than have it animate out. So that hold is really useful if you've got these nested clips or other animations that you're doing. It won't work in some instances where you've got your animation as keyframes. So this is useful if you want to hold an animation, don't want to change the keyframes. We can still double click into the compound clip and modify things, and you can see we've got these retime options. We can have that hold last as long as we want, and it will essentially play through now to the end. And let's have a look at one very last thing here, which is how we use the Ken Burns effect to get some similar effects to what we have here. So if we drag a new clip down to the timeline, the Ken Burns effect is underneath our transform controls where we've been adding keyframes. And really this is a quick way to add the same types of animations that we've been using up to now with different levels of control. So sometimes keyframes is useful because it gives you complete control over exactly where you want to move things. If we go to the crop options here for this last clip and then change this to Ken Burns, you can see we don't need to worry necessarily about changing the spatial conform, so it turns off the fit or fill. The Ken Burns is going to take care of all of that for us. So basically here we have a start point and an end point for our clips. We can click in those and move them around, decide where we want them to be. At the moment this would be zooming in, so if we play this through, you can see it's kind of moving up and zooming in, but we can modify that even more. So if we wanted to kind of gravitate towards this painting, the top middle for instance, then we can change the scale of this red box, and that will allow us to kind of really quickly get that to move in this way. And just the same as with our other animations, if we right click on the cross here, we can have an ease in or an ease in and out. So basically that's going to accelerate and decelerate at the beginning of this. Now the Ken Burns effect will last as long as the clip lasts, which means that if we stretch this out, then basically it's going to slow it down. So we've got that same animation between the two different points, between the green box and the red box, but it's just moving a bit more slowly. Then the other option we have here as well is we can flip this. So this little pair of hooked arrows, if we click that, it's going to change the start point to our zoomed in point. So we'll start zoomed in and then we'll move out. So you can see with the keyframes we get that rotation control. We can be more specific about how the animation happens. We can even add multiple keyframes about different parts of a zoom to control it there as well. But with the Ken Burns, we really get a quick effect that we can use right away and without having to do all that keyframing. So I find myself jumping between both these different tools. The keyframing is useful in a variety of different scenarios. We used it here on the motion blur as well. So we're using keyframes in different places. And the Ken Burns is really just a quick animation tool that allows you to create these quick image animations on your timeline. Now I do go into a bit more depth in another video about how to actually cut out and crop and composite images to create blurred parts of your image as well. And I'll leave a link to that below, but if you're looking to bring photos back to life in a documentary style, then that video will be useful for you as well. These image animation tools with keyframing will be useful in lots of different scenarios, but sometimes you'll want to go a bit more in depth and actually look at how you can blur out or focus in on different parts of an image. So I hope this has been useful. If you have any questions about animating in Final Cut Pro, the keyframes or the Ken Burns effect, then please do leave a comment below. Otherwise, I look forward to seeing you on the next video.